Like Jean, I want to say that Francesca also encouraged me to be personal. And like David, this is very much some beginning thoughts. Though with material and subjects that I've been thinking about for some time now. Thank you for inviting me to participate in this conference. It is a joy for me to be on this side of the Atlantic among friends and colleagues who have given me so much. I want to begin by saying a few words about Michael Paul Gallagher. I am sorry we never met and that I only began reading his work recently, for I think we might have had much in common. That affinity is doubtless one of the main reasons I was invited to participate in this conference at this wonderful school I first visited 5 years ago at the initial conference for the Power of the Word project. I want to explore this sense of affinity that will, I hope, in a roundabout way, take me to my proposed topic on women writing and Rahner's depths of the heart. The women I have in mind are two particular women writers I have an affinity for, the French thinker Hélène Cixous and the Dutch diarist Etty Hillesum. Though my bringing them together in this way with Rahner and Ignatian tradition is a beginning exploration, so forgive me for not being as polished or as finished as I might like. So this idea of affinity, of having much in common, is key, I think, to Gallagher's book that gives this conference its name, Dive Deeper. The aim of that work, Gallagher wrote in the opening paragraph, is to evoke our human adventure, to make Christian faith more real through exploring our ordinary but deep experiences. Gallagher's use of the second person makes that adventure, an ordinary but deep experience, something that is shared. He also tells us that we share a cultural desolation, an incapability of imagining God, an inability to reach the depths of ourselves, themes that appeared among us in yesterday's conversations. These past few years in the UK and US, both of which have been my homes, have been full of what could certainly be called cultural desolation. The title of this panel refers to the modern world, but the world I want to consider is this desolate one we inhabit now, one that seems in many ways far removed from at least what I would consider the modern world. We live in something else, but I'm not sure what to call it. It has taken many of us by surprise. After the US election, the philosopher Judith Butler spoke about this response of shock and surprise. Who are they, she asked, these people who voted for Trump? But who are we who did not see their power, who did not anticipate this at all, who could not fathom that people would vote for a man with racist and xenophobic discourse, a history of sexual offenses, the exploitation of workers, disdain for the Constitution, migrants, and a reckless plan for increased militarization? Perhaps we are shielded from the truth by our own isolated form of left and liberal thinking. Or perhaps we believed in human nature in some naive ways. Under what conditions does unleashed hatred and reckless militarization compel the majority vote? These conditions she speaks of grow increasingly cruel and brutal. It seems the lessons of the modern world of 20th century horrors are forgotten. In the US, there is talk about registering Muslims, of imprisoning and deporting hundreds of thousands or even millions of immigrants, of making lists of liberal college professors. In the past few weeks, the American Civil Liberties Union, the Southern Poverty Law Center, and Sean King of Black Lives Matter and the New York Daily News have tracked thousands of hate crimes around the country. Swastikas on playgrounds, in the subways, on synagogues, on the doors of a rabbi's home. African Americans, Muslims, women, the disabled have been targeted by mail, by phone, in person. At a white nationalist conference in Washington recently, one of the group's leaders posed the question of whether Jews are really people. Non-white Americans whose families have lived in the US for generations have been cursed and told this is Trump world and to get out. I am part of another world, a secret, though nothing is ever really secret anymore, Facebook group called Pantsuit Nation that is full of daily anecdotes of hatred against the other and how these have been and might continue to be resisted. That these social media experiences are shared ones provides support and staves off despair about those incidents of hate that come closer than social media. A colleague at the Connecticut University where I have been teaching, the day after the election sent out an email offering safe space for students and faculty who might have reason to fear. A Muslim student came into his office, he told me, and sat down and wept. She told him she was afraid to leave her house. What should she do? The colleague's wife teaches in Iowa. 2 of her women students were walking from town to campus when men in a pickup truck flying a Confederate flag on election night yelled, "We will grab your pussies, Trump Nation." The fear is palpable. My dearest and oldest friend urges me to buy a gun and go to the gun range for practice. I am afraid for my Jewish friends, for my gay friends, for women, Hispanics, people of color, Muslims. I am afraid for myself, for my students. I teach seminars in the Catholic intellectual tradition in which I am expected to show the students how to have scholarly conversations that are respectful, honest, open, community building. In this climate, it often seems an especially impossible and hopeless task. My students exist in a world with infinitely less hope in human progress and in faith in God than the America of the modern world. What can Ignatian tradition offer to such a world? In Dive Deeper, Gallagher claimed that whatever the circumstance, his life had taught him to believe both in humanity and in God. That disposition is perhaps the best of what Ignatian tradition can offer. To foster it, Gallagher urges that we dive deeper, and his conviction was, he wrote, that imaginative writers like biblical prophets can deepen our angle of seeing. Karl Rahner, the great Jesuit theologian of the 20th century, also believed this to be true, and Gallagher notes this. For Rahner, Gallagher writes, great poetry exists only where one faces radically what one is. In Rahner's theology, poetry can reach the heart, unite the scattered self, and prepare for recognition of revelation. In one of the books to be feted tonight, Poetry and Prayer, the 2nd volume of the Power of the Word project, I have written of Karl Rahner's neglected attentiveness to and love of poetry, of how he notes an affinity between poetry and prayer, of how, he says, Christianity must have an intimate relationship with the poetic word because of its special intrinsic relationship to the word. To be a Christian, he believes, one must have the power of hearing and understanding words of the heart, words that affect what they signify and penetrate into the primordial center of the human being. One must have the power of hearing authentic, reconciling words, and I cannot think of much that is more important in these dark times than that, to have the gift of speaking and hearing reconciling words. This power to hear, Rahner wrote, means that one has heard the poetic word and abandoned oneself to it in humble readiness, till the ears of the Spirit were open for it and it penetrated his, and I will add her, heart. Geza Elspeth Thiessen recognizes Rahner's love of poetry and links it to what Rahner referred to as anonymous piety, a piety outside the church that is sustained by the experience of God. Thiessen writes that this piety does not simply arise in the specific sphere of church, but connotes the fundamental relatedness of the human being to God and his/her witness to sincerity, truth, love, all actions founded on and pointing to God's universal grace. This witness includes authentic artistic creation and commitment. I confess it had been several years since I had turned to Rahner when I began to think about this conference. But when I did, I was struck again by the same qualities that drew me to his work 10 years ago when I read his Christian of the Future for the first time in my Jesuit Divinity School, Regis College in Toronto. What appealed to me then and still does now is a gentleness and humility I found in him. His constant concern for the pastoral, traits sorely needed in our aforementioned cultural desolation. And then there is his awareness of grace outside the church and his desire to reach out in friendship to those of other religions and no religion. I loved his basic optimism and intense concern for the integrity of the human being. He was very much an inhabitant of the modern world, yet he ought to be welcomed as a balm for this one. He creates, and for me and perhaps many others, a rare space in the Catholic Church in which to find welcome and consolation. Gallagher speaks of Rahner in a way that suggests he felt a resonance similar to my own. For Rahner, Gallagher writes, experiences of God happen not only in contemplative adoration or in moments of special self-transcendence, but mainly in humdrum and hidden fidelities. Whenever we live with trust or courage, we encounter the mystery of God, here quoting Rahner, in the concrete experience of our everyday life. One cannot live in pure inwardness. One cannot make oneself a pure spirit. One must have concrete actions as well. This space of affinity I seek to begin to delineate has such concerns held in common. Living with trust and courage while being attentive to those humdrum and hidden fidelities while taking concrete action. And yet the commonalities must not blind us to the differences between Rahner and Cixous and Hillesum. Particularly problematic for me is considering these two Jewish women in this Christian context, as there may be for me a temptation to find in their strange and moving writing a Christian message. Yet I also know that it has often been out of such discomfort of writing of Cixous and church in particular that I came to an important recognition that Cixous, and now I am also able to add in gratitude Hillesum, in her unconventional religiosity, has a profound awareness of grace, love, joy, community, soul that would put many Christians to shame. I borrow these Jewish women because they challenge and transform my own Christian identity. Inspired by Cixous, I seek in my reading and writing a religious practice that is a dive deeper, a literary mingling of religions in a search of a theology beyond dogmatic certainties. As Hillesum writes in her journal, I shall not intervene, but simply have faith. The women writers may need some introduction for those who are unfamiliar with the work of either or both. Cixous was born in 1937 in French Algeria to Jewish parents who were part of the diaspora, her father from Spain, her mother from Germany. Many members of her extended family on both sides were killed in the Holocaust. She grew up as an outsider among Arabs. As a schoolgirl, she fell in love with the French language, perhaps the only space in which she felt at home. Neither France nor Germany nor Algeria, she would write in My Algerians in 1997. No regrets, it is good fortune. Freedom and inconvenient, intolerable freedom. A freedom that obliges one to let go, to rise above, to beat one's wings. I feel perfectly at home nowhere. As you can imagine, such sentiments would be anathema to Trump world. Cixous is not easy to categorize or write about. Verena Andermatt Conley, who has written often and well on Cixous, notes this difficulty when she asks, how does one write on someone who is plurivalent, mercurial, and as mobile as her style of her writing? Jacques Derrida, whom Cixous considered an intellectual and spiritual companion, called her the greatest writer in the French language. a poet-thinker, very much a poet, and a thinking poet. She is a teacher, for decades a professor of literature at the experimental Université de Paris, which she helped found as an alternative after the political and pedagogical turmoil of 1968. She is prolific author of more than 40 books and over 100 articles, crossing multiple genres: theater, theory, experimental fiction, memoir, interview, notebooks. Though she defies the limited descriptions those labels suggest, as she deliberately crosses boundaries of fiction and theory, poetry and prose, interior and exterior. Cixous knows the interior depths and feels an affinity for those willing to go there. The writers I love, she writes, are descenders, explorers of the lowest and deepest. She places Hillesum among them. Etty Hillesum, 1914 to 1943, was a young Dutch Jewish intellectual whose journals and letters provide an account of her life in Amsterdam for 2 years during World War II before she was killed in Auschwitz in November 1943. Hillesum had degrees in law and Slavonic languages and made her living teaching Russian. She described herself as an aspiring writer, exclaiming in her journal, "How much I want to write, but never had the opportunity to publish." It is only through her journals and letters, the vast majority unpublished until 40 years later, that we know what a fine writer she already was. As Jan Garland writes of Hillesum in his introduction to An Interrupted Life, the diaries and letters of Etty Hillesum, 1941 to 1943, at her desk in the small room on Gabrielle Metzustraat, she produced one of the most remarkable texts of our time, a testimony of faith and love written in the darkest hours of modern history. Hillesum has had a great effect on Cixous, who describes the diaries as an account which struggles from hour to hour to save in the enclosure which becomes more and more narrow, more and more monstrous, the vestiges of life, until when there is no more earth, the sky remains, then less and less sky, until finally no more sky at all. Do you know of Etty Hillesum? I find solace reading her diary and letters, especially lately. She kept a diary from 1941 in which she records the gradual constriction of her outer world and the simultaneous expansion of her inner one. Living in an increasingly cruel and brutal world, as Cixous notes, she manages an incredible equanimity and magnanimity. I find there is something in the tone of those traits of hers that is Ignatian. Listen to her entry of 24 July, 1942. I would very much like to do an hour's hard studying before I start on this day. I feel a great need to do so, and I also have the necessary concentration. When worries start to assail me, again this morning, I simply jumped out of bed. God, take them away from me, please. I don't know what I shall do if they send for him. She was speaking of Julius Speer, her lover. What influence I can use on his behalf. We must accept everything as it comes and be prepared for the worst. Don't brood and don't be afraid, but be calm and think clearly. When the crucial moment comes, you will surely know what you have to do. My roses are still in bloom. I shall take that half-pound of butter to Yap. If all this suffering does not help us to broaden our horizon, to attain a greater humanity by shedding all trifling and irrelevant issues, then it will all have been for nothing. Tonight I shall dine with him in the Café de Paris. It is almost grotesque, an outing like that. Liesl said, "It is a great privilege, isn't it, that we have been chosen to bear all this. Liesl is a great woman, a truly great woman. I would like to write about her one day. We shall come through, no doubt." Reading Cixous, reading Hillesum, I feel like Cixous a mysterious affinity for these authors, what she calls a certain music she is attuned to. I think someone yesterday raised a question of what use is poetry in these desolate times. Something like that. A Hölderlin, a Heidegger question. The implication maybe is that it is silly to turn to poetry, to literature now. It is impossible. But Rahner, Cixous, Hillesum all suggest that it is more important now than ever. In an early work, the 1972 Vive l'Orange, To Live the Orange, Cixous writes of an apropos dilemma to our discussions. She has discovered the Brazilian novelist Clarice Lispector. She describes the experience in terms of someone coming out of a desert into an oasis. The reading transforms her. She writes in a new way, but she is guilty in her writing. A friend calls on the telephone demanding political action to save women of Iran. What to do? Shouldn't one go to the barricades? No, Cixous continues to write, asking, where does the question of Iran touch us? Far from the borders, from the tanks, from the laws, far from the Ayatollahs, from the French life, from the American farce in this inner clearing, where women invent without maps new kinds of happiness. That is what I experience also in the Pantsuit Nation group, women and men inventing without maps new kinds of happiness. In the concreteness of life, those men and women, like Rahner, Cixous, and Hillesum, find grace and courage. This affinity may not feel like enough for our desolation, but if we are considering Ignatian tradition, clearly, isn't that what is at the heart of Ignatius's exercises, a delicate affinity? What comes to mind is rule number 335, where mention is made of the action of the good angel on souls progressing to greater perfection. The action is, Ignatius says, delicate, gentle, delightful. It may be compared to a drop of water falling upon a stone. What use are poets in desolate times? Etty responds in the last entry of her diary. She had just referred to reading Rilke, which she continued to do right to the end. Sadly, in difficult times, we tend to shrug off the spiritual heritage of artists from an easier age with what use is that sort of thing to us now? It is an understandable but short-sighted reaction and utterly impoverishing. We should be willing to act as a balm for all wounds. Thank you.